Oh, don't look so surprised. Everyone's thinking it. Let us be honest, she saw dollar signs the moment she met him.
Mom.
I'm simply saying what half this room already knows, Ethan. A hospice nurse marries into the Whitmore family, and suddenly she's got a ring worth more than her yearly salary. Where did you get that necklace?
It was my grandmother's. Oh my God.
I want you to remember that moment. The silence after Constance asked her question. Because everything that happened after, the things that came out that night, the truth about my family and hers, the 60 years of history none of us knew we were standing on top of, it all started with a necklace nobody was supposed to notice. My name is Naomi Turner. 3 hours before that moment, I was the happiest I had ever been in my life. I had just married a man I loved, in a room full of people who, with one very notable exception, I thought had finally accepted me. I'd spent over a year being measured, quietly and not so quietly, against a standard I never agreed to be judged by. And for one afternoon, walking down that aisle, I let myself believe it was over. It wasn't over. It was about to get much bigger than I understood. I didn't know yet that the woman in the wheelchair had been waiting almost 60 years to ask that question. I didn't know that the necklace around my neck wasn't just a family heirloom passed down from a grandmother I'd never met. I didn't know that by the end of that night, the story my new mother-in-law had been telling about me for over a year, gold digger, opportunist, a nurse who married up, was about to be turned completely, publicly, inside out. But before I tell you what Constance Whitmore knew, I need to take you back further than that wedding. Back before I ever met Ethan, before I ever set foot in that mansion, to a woman I never got to know, my grandmother, Eleanor, because to understand why that necklace stopped a wedding reception cold, you have to understand what she carried and what she never told anyone. I grew up in a 2-bedroom rental outside Dayton, Ohio, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses on the east side of town for families who never once, in 14 years, asked her name. My father left when I was 4 years old. I don't remember much about him, just the sound of a door and my mother's face afterward, which I've spent my whole life trying not to describe as broken, because she wasn't. She just had to become someone entirely new, very quickly, with a 6-year-old and a stack of bills that didn't care about either of us. My mother's name was Rosalind. Everyone called her Roz. She worked 2 jobs most of my childhood, days cleaning, some nights at a diner off Route 4, and on the rare evenings she was home before I fell asleep, she'd tell me about her own mother, my grandmother Eleanor, who had died when my mom was only 19. Eleanor had worked as a private nurse. She cared for the elderly and the dying in the homes of families who could afford round-the-clock care, a job, my mother always said, that required a kind of strength most people never have to find out if they have. My mother didn't have many details about those years. Eleanor didn't talk about her work much. She'd come home from long placements quiet, sometimes for days, and my mother learned early not to press. What she didn't know was this. Eleanor had worked for one family longer than any other, nearly 2 years, caring for an elderly woman in Connecticut, and something had happened at the end of that placement that Eleanor never fully explained. She came home that final time different, quieter. My mother remembered her mother sitting at the kitchen table for a long while, just holding a small gold necklace in her palm, before finally putting it on and never taking it off again. Eleanor died of a stroke when my mother was 19, working her second-to-last placement, in a modest home 2 states away from the one that had changed something in her. My mother inherited very little, some clothes, a few photographs, and that necklace. She wore it herself for years before she gave it to me, the day I graduated from nursing school. I remember exactly what she said because I've thought about it 1,000 times since. She told me my grandmother wore that necklace every single day she worked, and that she'd said once it reminded her why she did the job, not for the money, for the people. My mother admitted she didn't fully know what Eleanor meant by that. She said she thought I was about to find out. I didn't understand what she meant either. Not for years. I followed my grandmother into nursing without entirely meaning to. I told myself at 18 that I wanted something stable, something with real purpose, and nursing checked both boxes. But I specialized in hospice care almost by accident, filling in for a coworker on a rotation I hadn't chosen, and something about it simply fit. Hospice work is not like the rest of medicine. You're not there to cure anyone. There is no victory lap, no discharge with balloons. You're there to make sure nobody dies alone or scared or in unnecessary pain, and that is a strange, sacred, exhausting kind of work that teaches you things about people nothing else does. It teaches you who shows up for their dying relatives and who suddenly develops a work emergency the week it gets hard. It teaches you who says the things that need saying before it's too late, and who runs out of time because they assumed, wrongly, that there would always be more of it. That's the job I was doing 3 years ago when I was assigned a new patient, Harold Whitmore. 86 years old, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 6 to 8 weeks to live if things went well, which they rarely did. And the Whitmore family, I learned quickly, was not like most of the families I usually worked with. They owned a textile manufacturing company that had been in continuous operation since the 1950s, old money, the kind that doesn't advertise itself, because it's never had to. The estate outside Greenwich, Connecticut had an actual name, like it was a person in its own right. I remember driving up the gated driveway for my first shift, GPS insisting I'd arrived at my destination, and thinking I'd somehow made a wrong turn onto a movie set. Harold was kind, in the exhausted, receding way dying men sometimes are, present in flashes, drifting the rest of the time. His grandson, Ethan, was the one who was actually consistently there. Every single day. He'd taken an open-ended leave of absence from his job in Boston to sit with his grandfather, read to him, argue with him about baseball statistics from decades ago, hold his hand through the difficult nights when the pain broke through the medication. I had worked in enough wealthy households by then to know that money doesn't guarantee presence. If anything, in my experience, it's often the opposite. Ethan was there because he wanted to be. That distinction told me more about him in the first week than most people learn about each other in months. We started talking in the hallway outside Harold's room, in the small windows of time between my rounds. Small things at first, how I took my coffee, whether I'd eaten anything since my shift started, how I was actually holding up, not the polite version of the question. Then longer things. He asked about my work, really asked in the specific, curious way people rarely do when they find out what you do for a living. I told him about my mother, about Eleanor, about the necklace I always wore and had never fully understood the meaning of. He noticed it on our third or fourth real conversation. He said it was beautiful. He didn't ask what it was worth. I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters more than it seems like it should, given everything that happened later. Harold died on a Tuesday morning in March, with Ethan holding his hand and me adjusting his oxygen for the last time, the room quiet except for the sound of a clock Harold had insisted stay on the wall despite Diane's suggestion that they replace it with something less morbid. Grief has a strange way of either pulling people apart or pulling them together. For Ethan and me, it was the second thing. He asked me to coffee 2 weeks after the funeral, an awkward, careful invitation, like he wasn't sure it was appropriate. I said yes, mostly because I already knew I didn't want to say no to someone I'd started caring about somewhere in the middle of the worst weeks of his life. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters for everything that comes later in this story. I never once, in all our months of dating, thought about Ethan's money. I thought about the way he sat with his dying grandfather every single day, without being asked. I thought about how he remembered which of my other patients I'd mentioned, because that's how he talked about them. Your patients, like my work, genuinely mattered to him, and wasn't just a curious fact about the woman he was falling for. I thought about how he remembered their names weeks after they'd passed, and asked how their families were doing. I fell in love with a man who showed up, consistently, for the people other men his age had learned to avoid. The fact that he happened to be wealthy was, to me, almost incidental, a detail about his life, not a reason for it. It became a problem only because of how his mother chose to see it. Diane Whitmore did not like me from the moment Ethan introduced us. 6 weeks after Harold's funeral, at a family dinner, I remember being far more nervous about than I let on. I want to be fair to her here because I've had time to think about this, and grief makes people protective in strange, sometimes ugly ways. She had just lost her father-in-law. Maybe some percentage of her coldness that first night was that. But it became clear within the first hour that her discomfort wasn't really about grief. It was about math. She asked over that first dinner what my background was. Not where I grew up, though that's how it was phrased, my background, the word landing with a specific, sorting kind of weight. I told her, plainly, about Dayton, about my mother cleaning houses, about nursing school paid for through scholarships and loans. I was, at that point, still 5 years from finishing off. I watched her face do the thing faces do when they've already decided something and are simply gathering evidence to confirm it. It got worse as Ethan and I got more serious, month over month. When he proposed, 8 months after Harold's death, at the small Italian restaurant where we'd had our first coffee-turned-dinner, Diane's first move wasn't to congratulate me. It was to schedule a lunch, just the two of us, where she suggested, in the gentlest possible tone stretched over the sharpest possible message, that a prenuptial agreement would be standard practice for a family like ours. You understand. I told her I'd already planned to sign one, gladly, before she'd even asked. I'd told Ethan the same thing the week he proposed. I don't think that was the answer she wanted. I think, in retrospect, she wanted a fight because a fight would have proven the story she'd already written about me. The rumors started sometime in the months after that lunch, reaching me the way rumors do, secondhand, softened by whoever was passing them along, but never soft enough. A cousin mentioned, almost as small talk, that Diane had told someone at the country club I was clearly after the Whitmore money and had said it with the specific confidence of someone repeating a fact rather than an opinion. A wedding planner accidentally forwarded me an email chain where Diane referred to me throughout as the nurse rather than by my name, discussing at length whether the guest list could be gently trimmed to exclude certain people Naomi might want to invite, my mother, my 2 closest friends from nursing school, women who had nothing but their own honest lives and no interest in performing for a room full of strangers. I remember one wedding planning meeting in particular, months before the ceremony, sitting across a table covered in fabric swatches and seating charts. Diane looked over the guest list, landed on my mother's name, and asked, in a tone dressed up as simple curiosity, whether Rosalind would be comfortable at a black tie event, as though my mother hadn't spent her whole life showing up wherever she needed to for the people she loved. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that my mother would be fine, that she was my mother. Diane smiled and moved on too quickly, saying she was just checking. I remember driving home, afterward gripping the steering wheel harder than the traffic warranted, replaying the exchange, trying to decide if I was overreacting. Looking back now, I know I wasn't. I was simply becoming fluent, faster than I wanted to, in the particular language wealthy families sometimes used to say something ugly while keeping their hands clean. Ethan tried to shield me from most of it, and when he couldn't, he fought his mother directly, more than once, more than I even knew about at the time. I found out only much later from Ethan himself that he'd told her flatly, during an argument I wasn't present for, that if she couldn't treat me with basic respect, she wasn't welcome at the wedding at all. That if she wanted to be his mother going forward, she needed to decide, right then, whether that mattered more to her than being right about a woman she'd known for less than a year. She backed off publicly after that conversation. The over-comments stopped. But I have worked hospice long enough to know that silence isn't the same thing as peace. People asked to stop saying something out loud usually just start saying it quieter, to more careful audiences, and wait for a moment when the guardrails feel far enough away. I met Constance twice before the wedding, both times briefly, at family dinners where she sat mostly silent at the head of the table, watching far more than she spoke, the way people sometimes do once they've outlived most of the people they used to bother performing for. I remember the first time her eyes caught on the necklace, a beat too long, a flicker of something I read, at the time, as simple old-age curiosity, and then her gaze moved on, and the conversation continued, and I didn't think about it again. I had no framework yet for what I was actually seeing. I assumed she was just an old woman quietly studying the stranger about to become family. I had no idea she was looking at a ghost. There was one dinner months before the wedding where I caught her staring again, longer this time, her lips moving slightly like she was trying to place something just out of reach. I heard her murmur, so quietly I almost missed it under the clatter of dinner conversation, something about knowing that necklace from somewhere. Nobody else at the table seemed to notice. Dinner moved on. I want you to sit in that moment with me for a second because it's the kind of thing you only recognize in hindsight. Constance had already started remembering. She just didn't have the pieces yet. Neither did I. The morning of the wedding, my mother helped me get dressed in the bridal suite of the hotel where the ceremony was being held. She fastened the necklace clasp at the back of my neck, her hands trembling slightly. She developed early-stage arthritis a few years before, and cold mornings made it worse. She told me, adjusting the pendant so it sat flat against my collarbone, that my grandmother would be so proud of me. I remember feeling, in that exact moment, unbelievably lucky, like the hardest part of the last 18 months was finally, officially behind me. I had absolutely no idea that within a few hours, that same necklace was going to blow open a secret the Whitmore family had been quietly sitting on for almost 60 years. The ceremony itself was small and, honestly, close to perfect. Ethan cried during his vows, which surprised most of the guests and absolutely did not surprise me. My mother cried through the entire thing, mascara ruined by the recessional, not caring even a little. For about 2 hours, standing in front of everyone who mattered to me, I let myself believe the worst of it really was over. The reception afterward is where things started, quietly at first, to come apart. Diane had been drinking, not excessively, I want to be fair, but enough to loosen whatever careful guardrails she'd maintained through the ceremony and the first part of the evening. I was making my rounds through the tables, thanking guests, when I found myself near the head table just as she was mid-conversation with a woman I didn't recognize, someone from her side of the guest list, glass of wine in hand. I heard her say, not lowering her voice nearly enough, that you had to wonder what a hospice nurse from Ohio was doing marrying into a family like theirs. The woman beside her tried to stop her, said her name in warning. Diane kept going anyway, said she was just saying what everyone at the reception was thinking, that let's be honest, I'd seen dollar signs the moment I met Ethan. Ethan heard it from 2 tables away. I heard it standing directly behind her. Half the head table heard it, and I felt my face go hot with that particular, specific kind of humiliation where you're suddenly, acutely aware of every single person watching to see how you'll react. Ethan crossed toward her fast, started to say her name in warning, but she talked right over him, said she was simply saying what half the room already knew, that a hospice nurse marries into the Whitmore family, and suddenly she's got a ring worth more than her yearly salary, and that she was allowed to say that. I want to tell you I had some perfect, composed response ready to go. I didn't. I just stood there, my hand rising to my throat, to the necklace, some instinct to touch something real and solid while everything around me felt like it was quietly tilting off its axis. That's when I heard the wheelchair. Constance had been sitting near the edge of the room for most of the night, quiet, watching the way she always did at these events. Now she rolled herself forward, faster than I had ever once seen her move in the 2 years I'd known her, and she wasn't looking at Diane at all. She was looking directly at me. At my neck. She asked me, in a voice that cut through everything else in that ballroom, where I had gotten that necklace. The whole table went completely still. I felt Ethan's hand find mine. I told her, quiet, thrown, that it was my grandmother's. She asked what her name was. I told her, Eleanor Marsh. Constance's hand went to her own chest, like something had physically struck her. The color left her face so fast that Ethan half rose out of his seat, genuinely worried for a second that she was having a medical episode. She wasn't. She was somewhere else entirely, 60 years in the past, standing in a room none of the rest of us could see. She said, so quiet I almost didn't catch it, that she had given that necklace away in 1967. The music had already stopped by then, the quartet unsure what to do with themselves. Now the entire head table, and most of the tables near it, had gone quiet, watching, waiting. Constance looked at me and said she needed to speak with me alone.
Now.
I want to pause here because this is the part of the story people always ask me about afterward, what it felt like in that gap, the walk from the ballroom floor to the private study, not knowing what was coming. The room didn't stay quiet for long. By the time Ethan wheeled his grandmother toward the study doors, I could already hear the whispering start behind me, a ripple moving table to table, guests leaning in toward each other, the specific electric hum of a room that senses something real is happening and doesn't yet know what. My cousin later told me she heard at least 4 different theories circulating before I'd even sat down in that study. That Constance recognized the necklace as stolen. That I'd somehow deceived the family. That there'd been some scandal in Eleanor's past nobody had ever mentioned. None of them were close. But I understood, walking through that ballroom with every eye tracking me, why people reach for the worst version of a story when they don't have the real one yet. It's easier than sitting with uncertainty. Diane tried to follow us toward the study. I heard her voice rising behind me, something about upsetting Constance, about this not being the appropriate time for family business. Constance didn't even turn around. She simply told Diane to sit down, 2 words, flat and final. I had never once heard anyone speak to Diane that way in the entire time I'd known this family. I had also never once seen Diane obey anyone that fast. Ethan wheeled his grandmother into the small private study off the ballroom. All dark wood and old books, the noise of the reception fading behind the closing door. He started to follow us in. Constance stopped him with a single raised hand, told him gently to give us a moment. He looked at me, uncertain. I nodded, though I had absolutely no idea what I was agreeing to. He stepped back into the hallway, and the door clicked shut. I sat down across from her, my wedding dress pooling around the chair, my heart going hard enough that I could feel it in my ears. Constance reached out and took my hand, not, I realized after a moment, to comfort me, but because her own hands had started shaking and she needed something to hold on to. She told me that her husband's mother, her mother-in-law, Vivian, had been cared for, in the last 2 years of her life, by a private nurse. This was 1965 into 1967. She said this woman was extraordinary, the kind of woman who made a dying person's final year feel like it still mattered, still counted for something, instead of just winding down. She said her name was Eleanor. I felt the room tilt again, differently this time, the floor going soft under me. I told her that couldn't be a coincidence. There was no way that was a coincidence. She said she didn't believe it was either. She told me Eleanor Marsh worked in this family's home for nearly 2 years, that she was with Vivian through the worst of it, through pain no amount of medication in that era really touched, through the parts of dying that families like to pretend don't happen. And when Vivian finally passed, Constance's father-in-law decided the family had no further use for her. Her voice had gone hard in a way I had genuinely never heard from her before. She told me he let Eleanor go without severance, without the pension he had promised her verbally, more than once, in front of witnesses, including Constance herself. She said he told Eleanor, and she remembered the words exactly because she'd been standing in the hallway and heard them through the door, that a nurse doesn't need a pension, she needs another job. As if 2 years of Eleanor's life, of her body, of everything she'd given this family, simply evaporated the moment it stopped being useful to them. I asked her, stunned, quiet, whether nobody had said anything, whether nobody had stopped it. She told me she was 26 years old then, newly married into this family, and she didn't have the power then that she has now. She said that wasn't an excuse, just the truth. She said she watched a woman who had given this family the most difficult, most sacred kind of work there is get thrown out with absolutely nothing, because the men running that household decided her labor had an expiration date the moment it stopped serving them. And she said nothing. She told me she had carried that for 60 years. My voice cracked asking her what the necklace had to do with any of it. She told me that before Eleanor left, the last time she ever saw her, she had given her something. She said it felt insufficient even as she was doing it, and it had felt more insufficient every year since. A gold necklace of her own. A small flower pendant. Nothing extravagant, but it was hers to give, and it was something. She said she told Eleanor to sell it if she needed the money more than the sentiment, told her she was sorry, though sorry didn't come close to covering it. And then Eleanor left, and Constance never knew what became of her. Not where she went, not whether she kept working, not whether she kept the necklace or sold it the following week for grocery money. She never knew what became of her at all. Until tonight. My hand rose to the necklace, once more, understanding fully landing now. I told her Eleanor had kept it, had worn it every single day she worked for the rest of her career, that my mother had told me it reminded her why she did the job. Constance closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were wet, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked every one of her 91 years. She told me that my grandmother was the reason she had spent 60 years quietly insisting to everyone in this family that a person's character has nothing whatsoever to do with their money, that the people who do the hardest, most invisible work in this world deserve more respect than we typically give them, not less. And she said her own daughter-in-law had just stood in that ballroom and accused me, a woman doing the exact work Eleanor did, with what she could already tell was the exact same integrity, of being here for their money. Constance wheeled herself back out into the ballroom with a steel in her spine I had not seen from her all night, all year, in the entire time I'd known her. I followed, still stunned, still trying to process 60 years of family history I hadn't known existed 10 minutes earlier. Ethan fell in beside me, gripping my hand, having caught only fragments through the door but understanding, from my face, that something significant had shifted. Her voice carried across that ballroom without needing to be raised, loud enough that conversation stopped on its own. She told the room she owed everyone in it a correction. I watched Diane stiffen at the head table. Constance told them that nearly 60 years ago, this family employed a private nurse named Eleanor Marsh, who cared for her mother-in-law with more devotion, more patience, and more genuine kindness than most of the people in that room had shown each other all night. She said that when Eleanor's work was finished, when Vivian had passed and there was nothing left for her to do, her father-in-law repaid 2 years of that devotion by discarding her without the pension he had personally promised her. She said it was a disgrace when it happened, and that she had carried the shame of not stopping it for 60 years. Diane's voice came out small and uncertain, asking what any of this had to do with tonight. Constance didn't hesitate answering her. She told Diane that Eleanor Marsh was my grandmother, that the necklace Diane had mocked me for wearing that night, the one she'd implied was proof of what I'd come there for, was a gift Constance herself had given to a woman this family had wronged and never made right. She told Diane that I hadn't married into this family's money, that if anything, this family had owed my family a debt for 6 decades that had never been paid. The silence that followed spread through the entire ballroom. Ethan tightened his grip on my hand. Somewhere near the back, I could see my mother had gone very still, one hand pressed over her mouth. Diane's voice, when it finally came, was much smaller than I had ever heard it. She said she didn't know. Constance told her no, she hadn't, because she had never asked. She told Diane she had looked at a woman who works 12-hour shifts holding the hands of dying strangers, doing work most people in that room couldn't survive a single week of, and assumed the worst about her character, because it was easier than considering, even for a moment, that she might be wrong. Diane looked down at her hands for a long moment. When she looked up again, her eyes were wet, and for the first time all evening, she looked less like an adversary and more like a woman confronting something about herself she didn't especially want to see. She turned to me directly for the first time all night and said, quietly, that she needed to think, that she was sorry, that she needed to think about all of this. It wasn't an apology, not really, not yet. But it was the first honest thing she'd said to me in 18 months, and after everything, that counted for more than I expected it to. Diane didn't say much else that night. What could she say, really, with the whole room having just watched 60 years of her family's history rearrange itself in front of her? I watched something shift in her face over the following hour. Not a full transformation. People rarely change that quickly or that completely, but the beginning of one. A crack in a certainty she'd been operating on comfortably for over a year. In the weeks after the wedding, Constance told me the rest of what she remembered about my grandmother, filling in details my own mother never had, because Eleanor had rarely spoken about her work even to her own family. Constance remembered her laugh, sudden and full, she said, surprising for how quiet Eleanor usually was. She remembered a woman who read poetry aloud to Vivian every single evening in the final months, not because anyone asked her to, but because it was the only thing that seemed to ease the pain near the end, when the medication alone wasn't enough. She remembered a kindness this family had repaid with carelessness and had never, in 60 years, made right. Constance made it right the only way she still could, at 91, with the time she had left. She set up a fund in Eleanor's name, not for me directly, though I'll admit I had to insist, more than once, that it not center on me, but for aging hospice and private care nurses who had worked without adequate pensions the way my grandmother had, women whose decades of invisible labor had never been properly accounted for by the families who benefited from it. It felt, to me, like the only response that actually made sense. Not a gift to me. A correction to a debt the family had owed someone else for a very long time that had nothing to do with whether I'd married well. My mother met Constance 3 weeks after the wedding at a quiet lunch Constance requested personally. I wasn't in the room for most of it, but my mother told me afterward that Constance had cried, actually cried, describing Eleanor to a daughter who'd only had 19 years with her. She told my mother things about Eleanor's work, small, specific things, the kind only a person who was there could know, that my mother had spent 30 years wishing someone could tell her. It didn't undo the loss. Nothing could. But it gave my mother something she hadn't had before, a fuller picture of who her mother had actually been, in the years my mother had been too young to really understand her. Diane and I are not close, even now, over a year later. I don't know that we ever fully will be, and I've made peace with that. But she did apologize to me directly, about 2 months after the wedding, in a conversation that was awkward, overdue, and, I'll give her this, honest. She told me she'd spent so long protecting the family's image, and by extension her own sense of who belonged inside it, that she'd stopped asking herself whether the people she was suspicious of actually deserved that suspicion in the first place. She told me she'd looked at my job, my background, the fact that I didn't come from money, and built an entire story around those facts without ever once actually looking at me. I don't know if that qualifies as growth or just the beginning of it. I've learned, in years of hospice work, that sometimes the beginning is all you're going to get from a person, and you have to decide for yourself whether that's enough to work with or not. I still wear my grandmother's necklace. I wear it to work the same way she did every single shift, for the same reason my mother gave it to me all those years ago, not because of what it's worth, but because of who it reminds me to be, and what it cost the woman before me to become that person. I think about that night often, about how close I came to being permanently defined, in that family's eyes and maybe in the eyes of everyone at that reception, by an accusation that had absolutely nothing to do with who I actually was. And I think about Constance, sitting quietly at the edge of that ballroom for most of the evening, watching, waiting, though she couldn't have known it, for the moment 60 years of silence would finally have somewhere to go. If you'd been standing in that room, would you have recognized what that necklace meant? Would you have known, looking at one small, worn piece of gold, that it was quietly carrying a debt 6 decades old, waiting for the right pair of eyes to finally see it? Tell me in the comments what you would have done in Constance's position, sitting on that secret for 60 years. And if this story moved you tonight, stay with me, because the next one might be even harder to believe.